The marble floor of Blackthorn House was cold enough to steal the warmth from a person's knees in under a minute. Lady Seraphina Blackthorn had been kneeling on it for 45. Around her, the laundry hall steamed and swirled copper basins full of soapy water, towers of household linens yet to be sorted, and the sharp, perfumed presence of a woman who had never once in her life bent low for anyone. Grace Blackthorn, Dowager Duchess, stood at the center of that room the way a storm stands at the center of a field. Unmovable, deliberate, entirely certain of her own power, Seraphina's fingers moved steadily through the rinse water, scrubbing embroidered linens against a wooden board. She did not look up. She had learned not to. Her back ached in the deep, pulling way that only a woman carrying a child in her final weeks would understand. Not sharp, not sudden, but constant, like a tide that never fully goes out. Her dark hair clung in loose strands against her temples. Her dress, a modest ivory day gown that would have looked perfectly respectable at any other hour, was damp at the hem and had been since just after breakfast. She had not asked for this. She had not complained about it either. That, perhaps, was her greatest act of courage, and the thing Grace Blackthorn had never properly calculated. "You missed the stitching on the left corner," Grace said from behind her. Her voice was the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume to cut deep. Again, Seraphina reached for the linen, corrected it, said nothing. The servants along the walls did not move. They had learned early that movement during these moments attracted attention, and attention under the dowager's watch was never a safe thing. Outside, December had stripped the last of the trees bare. The sky beyond the tall laundry windows was the color of pewter, the kind of sky that carries snow still to come. A gust rattled the upper panes. No one acknowledged it. Then the doors opened. Not quietly, the way servants moved in that house. Not with the announcement, the way guests were received. The great oak doors at the far end of the laundry hall swung inward with the particular confidence of a man who had not yet been told he was needed anywhere and had simply come home. Cold air rushed in ahead of him. Snow dusted the shoulders of his traveling coat. Duke Lucien Blackthorn stood in the doorway, and for one suspended, weightless moment, the entire room held its breath. He saw everything. His wife on her knees, her reddened hands, the basin, the linens, his mother standing above her, straight-backed and unapologetic. His eyes moved slowly across the room, cataloging every detail the way a man catalogs the scene of a wrong he cannot yet name quietly, thoroughly, and with a fury too controlled to be anything other than absolute. Grace Blackthorn met her son's gaze across the length of that room. Her chin lifted. She did not explain herself. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what was said next, because of what Lucien's eyes did when they finally found Seraphina's, the softness that broke through his controlled expression, the guilt that followed it like a shadow, and the quiet, unmistakable resolve that settled behind them both. He had left the household. He had come back to find a battlefield, and from that moment on, there would be no more silence. "Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. All right, thank you. Now let's get back to the story." Seraphina had not always lived inside silence. There was a version of her, not very far back in memory, who had been loud about her opinions at dinner tables, who had laughed too freely at her father's bad jokes, who had once told a bishop politely, but directly, that she disagreed with his reading of a particular passage of Scripture, that Seraphina had not known yet what certain rooms could do to a person over time. Blackthorn House was not a cruel place by appearance. By appearance, it was a magnificent Georgian estate set against the Virginia countryside, its cream stone facade rising 4 stories, its grounds sweeping away in every direction in the kind of measured, geometric beauty that announced money so old it had stopped needing to announce itself. The interiors were grander still, gilded ceilings, ancestral portraits with eyes that followed you, fireplaces big enough to stand in, every surface polished to a shine that reflected back your own face, whether you wanted it to or not. Seraphina had arrived there as a new bride of 22, carrying a modest background and an extraordinary capacity for warmth, and she had understood within the first week that one of those two things would be welcomed and one would not. Her background was the problem. Her father had been a well-regarded physician in Alexandria, not nobility. Not by any stretch of the tradition Grace Blackthorn held sacred, but educated, respected, and honest. To Grace, those qualities were faint consolation prizes. To the Blackthorn dynasty, a bride without old blood and older money was a compromise, and Grace had made certain Seraphina understood that, not through cruelty so obvious it could be named, but through the quieter, more sophisticated cruelty of exclusion. Seraphina had been left out of household decisions that should have belonged to her. She had been corrected in front of staff for choices that were not incorrect, but simply different from how Grace would have done them. She had been spoken to, at social gatherings, in a particular tone reserved for people the speaker considers tolerable, but not quite equal. A tone measured not in volume, but in degree of warmth withheld. And she had endured it, not because she was weak, but because she understood something that Grace, in all her decades of commanding rooms, had never properly learned, that silence, chosen deliberately, is not the same thing as surrender. It is a strategy. It is a long game. It is the decision to preserve one's dignity instead of spending it on arguments that cannot be won in a single afternoon. When the pregnancy was confirmed 6 weeks after Lucien had departed for the northern estates to manage a land dispute that had stretched from weeks into months, Seraphina had written to him with the news, and the letter she received in return was tender, careful, and full of a warmth she had not fully expected. He was glad. He was grateful. He was delayed. Grace received the news differently. "You will need to learn discipline," the dowager had said at breakfast the morning after the announcement, her tone clinical and unhurried. A Blackthorn heir requires a mother of strong constitution, not a woman given to fragility. "I am not given to fragility," Seraphina had replied, equally calm. Grace had looked at her over the rim of her teacup, with an expression that suggested the sentence had not been worth the breath it took. The forced labor had begun 3 weeks later. Not all at once. Grace was too intelligent for that. First came the subtle reassignment of certain household duties. The management of guest linens, personally. The oversight of kitchen inventory, personally. Then came the presence in spaces no Duchess was ever actually expected to occupy. In the pressing rooms and the wash halls, among steaming basins and stacked crates. Under the guise of learning the full operation of a great house, the servants had watched uncomfortably and said nothing. Not one of them believed the Dowager Duchess was motivated by education. By the time Lucien had been gone 2 months and Seraphina's pregnancy was unmistakably visible, the work had escalated. Laundering, sorting, carrying, tasks that would have been inappropriate for a healthy woman of her station, let alone one in her condition. Her physician, a quiet man named Dr. Harlan Webb, who had served the Blackthorn family for 20 years, had advised rest. Grace had received that recommendation with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that a man's professional opinion is relevant only when it aligns with her own. Dr. Webb had tried once more. He had phrased it carefully, deferentially. Grace had thanked him, smiled, and continued precisely as before. It was in the 3rd month of Lucien's absence that a footman named Theodore Young, loyal, possessed of the kind of quiet moral seriousness that so often goes unnoticed in large households, began writing letters. He did not tell anyone. He simply wrote. And somewhere along the roads of the northern counties, a duke had begun to read. The day Lucien returned unannounced had begun like every other day in Blackthorn House, with Grace in command and Seraphina quietly enduring whatever form that command had decided to take that morning. It had been a laundry day, the large, comprehensive kind that happened once a fortnight and occupied the entire household staff from morning until late afternoon. Seraphina had been informed of her expected participation the previous evening, not as a request, but as a schedule, slipped beneath her chamber door in Grace's neat, upright handwriting. She had read it standing in her nightgown in the lamplight, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, and she had made a decision that perhaps only a woman at the outer limits of her endurance truly understands. She had folded the paper, set it on the mantel, and gone to sleep. Not because she had accepted the instruction. but because she had learned that the most important fights are the ones you wake up rested for. By 10 in the morning, she was in the laundry hall. The room was warm from the copper boilers and full of the particular smell of lye soap and damp fabric. Steam rose from the basins in slow, lazy curls. Seraphina had found a position beside the lowest rinse basin lower than the others, easier on her back, and had begun working without complaint. Around her, the household maids moved steadily, heads down, saying only what was necessary. Grace arrived at 11. She entered the way she always entered large rooms, fully aware that the room would rearrange itself around her without being asked. She wore a deep burgundy gown embroidered at the collar and cuffs with gold thread. Every piece of jewelry she had chosen that morning appeared to have been selected by someone who considered ornament a form of authority. She looked, as she always looked, absolutely and entirely in charge. "You are behind," she announced, surveying the half-sorted linens with a brief, dismissive glance. "We began at the same hour as always," said one of the senior maids carefully. Grace's gaze moved from the maid to Seraphina. "The embroidered sets have not been started." She paused. "Lady Seraphina, those require hand scrubbing. Begin them." The embroidered sets were the heaviest linens in the house. They were also the ones that required the person doing them to kneel beside the low basin, which meant 40 minutes, at minimum, on the marble floor. Several maids exchanged glances. None spoke. Seraphina rose from her stool, crossed the room, lowered herself to her knees, with the particular careful slowness of a woman who has learned to make every physical movement a dignified one. She did not wince. She did not look at Grace. She simply picked up the first linen and began. Grace watched for a moment. Something crossed her expression, not satisfaction exactly, more the particular look of someone confirming a hypothesis they had already decided was correct. Then she turned and began directing the rest of the room. An hour passed. Seraphina's lower back had moved past aching and into something quieter and more persistent, a steady tightness that radiated outward with each movement. She breathed through it. The child shifted, and she paused, hand pressed flat against her side for just a moment, steadying. One of the younger maids, a girl barely 16 named Abby, saw it. She moved toward her. "My lady, please let me." "She is fine," said Grace, without looking up from her inventory list. "Continue your own duties, Abby." Abby stopped. I looked at Seraphina. Seraphina gave her the smallest, most reassuring nod she could manage, and the girl retreated, her eyes bright with something she was not permitted to say out loud. Seraphina returned to the linen. It was perhaps 20 minutes after that when the doors opened. She heard the cold before she heard the footsteps, a sudden draft that moved through the warm room and lifted the steam in strange directions. She heard the silence that fell over the staff, like a blanket dropped from a height. She did not immediately understand why the room had stopped. Then she heard Grace say very quietly, and at a register Seraphina had never heard her use before, "Lucien." Seraphina lifted her head. He stood in the doorway in his traveling coat, which was charcoal wool and dusted along the shoulders with half-melted snow. He was taller than the door frame seemed prepared for. His dark hair was slightly damp from the cold, and there was the particular quality of controlled stillness in his posture that Seraphina had learned, over their years of marriage, meant that he was not still at all. He was simply choosing not to move until he had understood everything in front of him. His eyes found her. She watched him register what he was seeing. The basin, her hands, her knees on the marble, the redness at her wrists where the water and the lye had reached, the swell of her belly, the lateness of the pregnancy. The room was full of servants who had all stopped breathing. Something happened behind his eyes. Not a flicker, more like a door closing very quietly. "Seraphina," he said. His voice was low and entirely even and more terrifying for it. She rose to her feet steadily, without allowing herself to rush, because dignity is not only for comfortable moments, and she met his gaze across the room. "You're home early," she said, and her voice, somehow, was perfectly calm. Lucien looked at her for a moment longer. Then, very slowly, he looked at his mother. Grace Blackthorn had ruled Blackthorn House for 30 years. She had navigated the deaths of rivals, the ruin of enemies, the quiet machinery of aristocratic society with the skill of a woman who had learned early that power, once claimed, must be maintained without apology. She had looked without flinching at disappointments, disasters, and demands. She had never been looked at by her son quite the way he looked at her now. She lifted her chin. "You must be tired from your journey. Come upstairs." "I will come upstairs," said Lucien, "when I am ready." The room was so quiet that the fire beneath the nearest copper boiler sounded, for a moment, very loud. He crossed to Seraphina. He took her hands, her reddened, water-pruned hands in both of his, and he looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at her face. "Walk with me." It was not a question, but it was also not the command he could have made. It was the voice of a man who understood that the woman beside him had been given too few choices for too many months, and was determined, from this moment forward, to always offer her one. Seraphina placed her hand in the crook of his arm. They walked out of the laundry hall together, and the great oak doors closed behind them, and every servant in that room stood very still for a long moment in the sudden quiet, and then, very softly, because no one could quite stop it, Abby began to cry with relief. Lucien did not begin with accusations. He was not, by nature, a man given to speeches. He had always been more dangerous in his quietness than his volume, which was part of what had made him so effective as a duke and so difficult to read as a husband. He walked Seraphina to the east sitting room, a smaller, warmer space off the main corridor, rarely used in winter because it faced away from the afternoon sun, and he settled her into the armchair closest to the fire, and then he did something that surprised her entirely. He sat on the floor at her feet, not in any dramatic fashion. He simply lowered himself to the rug, rested his arms across his knees, and looked up at her. "Tell me," he said. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. This was not the man she had watched walk away 3 months ago. Not that she had expected him to return unchanged, but this was different. There was something in his face that had not been there before. A rawness, a quality of attention she recognized as rare in people who have spent their whole lives having others attend to them. "You already know," she said gently. "Theodore's letters told me some of it." He paused. "I want to hear yours." She considered refusing. She had built such careful architecture around her silent walls of dignity and restraint, constructed one quiet moment at a time, and there was a part of her that feared what might come loose if she began to dismantle it. But he was looking at her as though her answer mattered, not as a matter of household management or marital obligation, but as though what had happened to her had happened to something he considered important. So she told him, calmly, completely. She told him about the morning the kitchen inventory had appeared among her required tasks. She told him about the first laundry day, and how Grace had stood over her with a posture that communicated clearly that humility was not being taught but enforced. She told him about Dr. Webb's visits and Grace's dismissal of them. She told him about Abby, who was 16 years old and had once tried to take a heavy basket from Seraphina's hands and been sharply corrected in front of 6 other servants for doing so. She told him about the night she had sat alone in their bedroom with her hands in her lap, the child moving restlessly inside her, and she had understood with the particular clarity that comes only in the small hours of the morning that no one in that house was going to help her unless someone with more power than Grace decided it mattered. Lucien did not interrupt. He did not offer responses that were actually defenses in disguise. He simply listened, in the complete way that human beings almost never listen to each other, and Seraphina felt the strange, slightly disorienting experience of being heard. When she finished, the fire had burned low. Outside, the first proper snow of December had begun to fall. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not only for being absent, for every time before that I was present in body and not in attention." Seraphina looked at him. "That is a very large apology. It is a very large debt." She wanted to say it was fine, the way she always said things were fine, but something like the fire, the snow, the fact that he was sitting on the floor and looking at her as though her response genuinely mattered stopped her. "It hurt," she said instead. "Simply, honestly. I want you to understand that it did. Not for sympathy, because I want you to know the truth." He held her gaze. "I know, and I will spend a considerable amount of time making it my business to make sure nothing like it happens again." She believed him. That, perhaps more than anything, was what broke through the last of the careful walls she had spent 3 months building. She did not cry. She was not, despite everything, a woman who cried easily, but her shoulders came down from where they had been, held high for months in the unconscious posture of a person expecting the next blow. They simply came down, and she breathed. That evening, while Seraphina rested, Lucian moved through Blackthorn House with the particular quiet efficiency of a man conducting a private audit. He spoke to Theodore first, the footman who had written the letters, who stood very straight when Lucian thanked him and said, with the simplicity of someone who had not done it for reward, that he had only done what seemed right. Lucian noted the answer. He would not forget it. He spoke to the housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, who had served Blackthorn House since before Lucian was born, and who told him, in a voice carefully stripped of judgment, the facts as she had observed them clearly, precisely, without embellishment. She had the manner of a woman who understood that the truth, delivered plainly, carries its own weight. He spoke to Abby, who turned scarlet at being addressed by the Duke directly, and then, when he assured her she was not in any trouble, told him about the basket she had not been permitted to carry, and the fear that had kept her from doing more than offering small kindnesses in secret. By the time Lucian had finished his private investigation, it was past midnight. He stood in the east corridor alone, looking out at snow falling over the front drive, and he remained there for quite a long time doing nothing that anyone watching could have identified as an action, but which was in fact the specific and demanding work of a man deciding what kind of person he intends to be from a given moment forward. He went to Grace's study next. His mother was still awake. She had been waiting, which told him everything about how confident she was that she could manage the conversation. She was seated at her writing desk in her evening robe, composed and unhurried. "You've been speaking to the staff," she said, as he entered. "I have." "And you formed conclusions?" "I have." She set down her pen. "Lucian, you do not have the full understanding of what I was attempting." "Mother." His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "I am going to speak, and then I am going to ask you one question, and I would like you to hear both before you respond." A pause. She nodded. "What you did to Seraphina was cruel. I understand that you do not see it that way. I understand that inside your reasoning there is a logic that makes sense to you. But I need you to understand that the outcome, regardless of the intention, was a pregnant woman on her knees on a marble floor being refused assistance by the people who should have been offering it." He looked at her steadily. "That is the outcome. That is what I came home to." Grace's jaw had tightened, but she did not interrupt. "Here is my question," Lucian continued. "When you look back at what has happened these past months, not at your reasons, not at your intentions, but at what actually occurred, what do you feel?" Grace Blackthorn had navigated 30 years of aristocratic life by never answering the questions she had not prepared for. She opened her mouth. I closed it. For a moment, something raw moved behind her eyes. "Just a moment. I will await your decisions regarding the household," she said finally, in a voice slightly smaller than usual. "Whatever they are." It was not an answer, but it was something that looked, from certain angles, very much like the beginning of one. Lucian left her there in the lamplight, and did not look back. Seraphina woke to a light she had not expected. It was still early gray winter morning pressing softly against the curtains, but there was a warmer quality to the room than there should have been at that hour, and she lay for a moment in the comfortable confusion of someone who has slept well for the first time in a very long time, and is not quite certain how to receive it. Then she saw the box. It sat on the small table beside her bed-polished mahogany, no larger than a hat box, with a sprig of winter holly laid across the lid. She had not left it there. Her maid had not mentioned it. She sat up slowly and reached for it, and when she lifted the lid she found, first, that the interior was lined with deep green velvet, and second, that resting inside that velvet was a sapphire necklace of extraordinary age and quality. She recognized it. The necklace belonged to Lucian's grandmother, a woman Seraphina had only ever seen in the large oil portrait that hung at the head of the main staircase. The woman in the portrait wore it against a deep blue gown, and the necklace looked in that portrait exactly the way it looked now, like something made in an era when jewelry was not only an ornament but a declaration. Beneath it was a folded note. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Lucien's precise, upright, with the slight leftward lean that had always, privately, made her certain he had been a very serious child. She wears it now because she has earned it. 7 words. No elaborate declaration. No performance. Seraphina sat with the note in her hands for quite a long time, listening to the morning settle into the house around her, and she felt something she had not felt inside these walls in far too long. Safe. Word of the necklace, because things always travel in large houses, along the particular invisible highways of servants and neighbors and visiting ladies, reached the morning room before breakfast was finished. By luncheon, 3 households had heard. By mid-afternoon, the story had acquired the life of something that carries both truth and interest in roughly equal measure. The necklace was not merely jewelry. It was a signal that everyone with any familiarity with the Blackthorn family understood. That necklace passed not by tradition, but by personal choice, from one Duchess to the next. Grace had worn it at her own presentation. The fact that Lucien had taken it from wherever it had been stored and placed it beside Seraphina's bed, without ceremony or announcement, was the most efficient possible public statement, without requiring a single public word. Grace became aware of this by late afternoon. Her expression, when she learned of it, was the expression of someone who had just watched the weather change in a direction they had not prepared for. That evening, Lucien found Seraphina in the library. She was seated in the wide chair nearest the fireplace, the one with the faded burgundy upholstery that had been in that room since before either of them was born, with a book open in her lap that she had clearly not been reading. He knew this because the book was upside down. She was looking at the fire. He sat in the chair across from her without announcing himself. She looked up. "The necklace was your grandmother's," she said. "It was." He paused. "She would have liked you. You never told me about her." Something shifted in his expression. She was the kind of woman who believed that the measure of a household was how the people with the least power within it were treated. A brief pause. She would have had something extensive to say about the past 3 months. Seraphina was quiet. "Then, why didn't you tell me any of this earlier? About who she was, about what she valued?" The question sat between them in the firelight. "Honest, it's a little painful, because I was not paying attention," Lucien said, in the straightforward way of someone who has decided the truth is more useful than a flattering explanation. "I believed that the household was operating as a household should, because nothing told me otherwise, and nothing told me otherwise because I had not made it sufficiently clear that I wanted to know." He looked at her directly. "That was a failure of mine, not yours. Mine." Seraphina considered this. "Most men in your position would find a way to phrase that differently." "Most men in my position," he said quietly, "have not recently returned to find their wife on her knees in the laundry hall." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who were beginning, slowly and with some care, to close a distance neither had fully known how to name. "I would like to try again," Lucien said eventually. "Not from where we were when I left. Further forward than that." "How much further forward?" Seraphina asked. He looked at her across the fireplace. There was something very simple in his expression. Unguarded. The face of a man who has made a decision and has stopped pretending he hasn't. "As far as you'll allow," he said. It was not a sweep of grand romance. It was better than that. It was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by every resource except the one that matters most. The courage to be genuinely honest with the person you love, trying, at last, to be exactly that. Seraphina did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, and then for the first time since he had come home, for possibly the first time in months, she smiled. Fully. Freely. It was the kind of smile that changes the atmosphere of a room. Lucien looked at her as though he had forgotten entirely that smiling was something she did, and was now reminded of it in a way he intended never to forget again. 2 days after Lucien's return, Grace Blackthorn made an error that would define the remainder of her season. She sent invitations. It was not unusual. Blackthorn House had hosted winter gatherings for longer than most of the county's current residents had been alive, and Grace had always managed them with the particular combination of elegance and authority that reminded every attendee, pleasantly but firmly, whose household this was. The gathering she assembled that Friday was, on paper, a celebration of Lucien's return. The guest list included the 3 most socially prominent families in the county, 2 visiting lords from the capital, and a number of lesser nobility and their wives who had always found Blackthorn gatherings both prestigious and reliably entertaining. Off paper, the gathering was something else. Grace had spent 2 days watching the balance of the household shift away from her in ways both practical and symbolic, and she had decided, with the particular clarity of someone who has been outmaneuvered, but not yet outpositioned, that a public moment was what was required. An audience, a setting large enough that her authority could be visibly reasserted, and Seraphina's unsuitability for the role she occupied could be raised not as a private family concern, but as a matter of proper social record. She had, in short, decided to take this outside. The ballroom glittered that evening with the kind of beauty that Blackthorn House did very well. Crystal chandeliers at full blaze. The long windows hung with deep winter velvet. A quartet positioned in the gallery above. Flowers in extraordinary quantity for the season. The guests arrived in layers of silk and wool, their breath creating brief clouds in the winter air before they stepped inside into the warmth. Seraphina descended the main staircase on Lucien's arm. She wore a silver gown her lady's maid, a pragmatic woman named Clara, who had made it her quiet mission in recent months to ensure Seraphina's dignity was supported wherever Grace's hospitality was withheld, had chosen it with specific intention. Against Seraphina's dark hair and the sapphire necklace at her throat, the effect was remarkable. She moved slowly, because the child was making slow the only option, but she moved with the particular uprightness of someone who has been underestimated for a very long time and has decided tonight is not the night to hide it. The room reacted. Seraphina felt the slight shift in attention, the murmurs, the glances that landed and stayed. She was accustomed to being looked at in this house, but this was different. These were not looks of assessment. They were looks of surprise. And underneath the surprise, the particular look that people give when something they have been told does not match what they are seeing. Grace, standing at the far end of the room, received Lucien with warmth that was entirely cosmetic. He did not miss this. He received it with equal cosmetics, which was its own kind of communication. For the first hour, the gathering proceeded with the pleasant inconsequentiality of most aristocratic entertainments. Conversations about travel, about estates, about the season's unusually cold onset. Lucien moved through the room with the ease of a man who has always known he owns the oxygen in it, pausing to introduce Seraphina to every cluster of guests they reached, never once in front of her as a husband who is managing his wife's social engagements, but always beside her, as an equal with his own enthusiasm for the conversation. It was noticed. These things always were. Grace watched from a distance and let the hour pass. Then she moved. She did it elegantly, as she did everything. A raised hand to the quartet, who faded into silence. A positioning of herself at the center of the ballroom floor, which caused the guests by years of trained social instinct to turn toward her and create the audience she required. "My friends," she began, with the warm confidence of a woman who has opened many rooms this way. "Before the evening continues, there's a matter I feel I must address because I care, as I believe you all do, for the future of this family." Seraphina felt the air in the room change. Beside her, Lucien became very still. Grace continued with precision and considerable skill. She raised the question of background. She invoked tradition. She spoke of the responsibility that came with the Blackthorn name, and she phrased her meaning carefully enough that no single sentence could be extracted as a clear attack, but the accumulation of them was unmistakable. She was building a case, before witnesses, for why the woman carrying the next Blackthorn heir was not entirely suited to be doing so. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. A few looked at their shoes. One woman, Harriet Forsyth, who had never liked Grace, but had always been too pragmatic to say so, looked directly at Seraphina with an expression of undisguised sympathy. Seraphina stood straight. Her face did not betray what she was feeling, which was a combination of humiliation and something else, something that had been building quietly, through weeks of laundry hauls and cold marble and dismissals, and which now, facing an audience, had resolved itself into a pure and unencumbered refusal to perform distress for anyone in that room. She lifted her chin. She looked at Grace with calm, steady, level eyes. She did not look away. Grace faltered, almost imperceptibly, mid-sentence. And then a voice cut through the room. Enough. Every head turned. Lucien stepped forward from where he had been standing at Seraphina's side. He moved through the guests with the unhurried certainty of someone who understands that he does not need to rush, because the room is already his. He stopped at the center of the floor, the same floor his mother had claimed, and he stood there in the quiet that had fallen like a held breath, and he looked at the assembly of his neighbors and peers. "I will not hear my wife spoken of this way," he said, "in this house or any other." Grace had gone very still. Lucien continued, his voice low and carrying, the voice of a man speaking a truth he has been waiting some time to say. "There has been a misunderstanding in this household, and I take full responsibility for my part in allowing it. The woman who carries my name and my child has shown more grace, more strength, and more genuine Blackthorn character than this family has deserved." He paused. "Let it land. The only deficiency I have observed is mine in leaving her without adequate protection for too long." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the candles burning. And then Lucien did something that no one present would ever fully describe to others, without a slight difficulty in finishing the sentence, because there was no precedent for it, and it short-circuited every social script the room contained. He crossed to Seraphina. He took her hand. He looked at her directly, not at the room, not performing, but actually at her. And then he went down on one knee. A collective sound moved through the ballroom. Not words. Something beyond words. "The heir to Blackthorn House," he said quietly, looking up at Seraphina, "stands before me now, and she has never needed a single one of us to validate it." He covered her hand with both of his. "I am sorry it took me this long to say it in front of witnesses." Seraphina looked down at her husband, this serious, contained man who was on his knee on the ballroom floor of his ancestral home in front of every person of consequence in the county, and she felt something entirely unprecedented move through her. Later she would not be able to explain what caused what happened next. The emotion, perhaps, or the child, who had been restless all evening, or the particular quality of that moment of being seen, genuinely and publicly seen, for the first time reaching some limit that her body had quietly set and not announced. Whatever the cause, the result was immediate. Her hand tightened on his. Her breath changed. "Lucien," she said. He was already standing, already close. "The baby," she said. "It's now." The ballroom dissolved into motion. There is a particular quality to the hours that follow a crisis, the way a large house reorganizes itself around a single center of urgency, the way all the usual social machinery stops and is replaced by something much more basic and human. Blackthorn House, which had for years operated according to the precise choreography of status and tradition, became in those first minutes something simpler, a household of people trying to help a woman through one of the oldest and most demanding passages of a human life. Dr. Webb arrived within the hour. He came without the careful deference he usually employed around the dowager, and went directly up the stairs, black bag in hand, with the focused practicality of a man who has delivered children in rooms ranging from manor houses to farmhouses and understands that the child does not particularly care which one it is. The guests, to their considerable credit, cleared the house with efficiency and tact, collecting coats and murmuring farewells in the entry hall with the cooperative quiet of people who understand that the drama they have just witnessed has concluded, and the most respectful thing they can offer now is their absence. Harriet Forsyth stopped at the door and turned back to Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, and said, "Please send word when all is well." There was nothing arch about it. She meant it. Lucien did not leave Seraphina's side. This was noticed by every member of the household staff who moved through that corridor during those hours, because it was not, in the tradition of great houses, entirely usual. Husbands of his station were expected to await news in a drawing room. They were expected to pace in a civilized fashion and be informed at intervals. They were not expected to remain physically present, to hold hands, to speak quietly, to be at every moment of difficulty actually there. Lucien was entirely there. When Seraphina's pain sharpened, he did not flinch. When she reached for his hand, he gave it, without commentary. When she said, at some point after midnight. I am so tired, he said, with complete honesty. And no, you are also the bravest person in this room. She had looked at him sideways at the look of someone deciding whether a compliment was sincere, and apparently concluded it was, because she had tightened her grip on his hand and gone back to work. In the corridor outside, another figure moved through the night. Grace Blackthorn had not left the house. She had retreated to the small sitting room off the east wing after the guests departed, and there she had sat, alone, in a chair by an unlit fireplace, in the dark. She sat there for a very long time. It is worth understanding, because Grace Blackthorn was not a simple woman. Whatever the events of recent months might suggest what was happening in that chair, in that dark room, she was not strategizing. She was not planning her next move. She was doing something she had not done in decades. She was remembering. Her own marriage had been arranged when she was 19. The man who became her husband had not been cruel, but had been indifferent, which is a different species of cold, and she had learned early that survival in a great house required armor, and armor, once forged, reshapes the body that wears it. She had built her authority through discipline and vigilance, because those were the only tools available to her in a world that had not offered many others, and she had never fully examined the cost of that construction. It had simply been necessary, or so she had told herself. Sitting in that dark room, she looked at Seraphina through memory, through the picture of a young woman on her knees on a marble floor, and she saw, with a particular horrifying clarity that comes only when all the useful distractions are removed, not a threat, not a weakness, a young woman who had been given none of the resources Grace had once wished desperately that someone had given her. At some point past 2 in the morning, Clara Seraphina's maid, whose loyalty had never wavered, came through the corridor with hot water and saw Grace standing in the hallway outside Seraphina's chamber. She stopped uncertain. "Is there news?" Grace asked. "The physician says it is going well, Your Grace." Grace nodded. Then, very quietly, "Is she enduring it well?" Clara looked at her. I looked carefully. "She is remarkable," she said, which was neither more nor less than the truth. Grace said nothing more, but she did not go back to her room. She remained in the corridor until the sky outside the high window began, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. Just before dawn, Dr. Webb appeared in the doorway. He removed his spectacles. He polished them. He put them back. "Your Grace," he said. Lucien was on his feet before the sentence was complete. The physician smiled the kind of smile a man wears when he has earned the right to give good news. "A son. Both are well." Lucien stood very still for one moment. The stillness of someone receiving information about their body is not immediately certain how to process it. Then, very quietly, he sat down on the bench along the wall, leaned forward, and rested his face in his hands, not from despair, from the relief that only comes when you have been afraid of something you have not allowed yourself to fully acknowledge being afraid of. When they placed his son in Seraphina's arms and Lucien crossed to stand beside her, neither of them spoke for a long time. The child was small and pink and entirely unimpressed by the weight of the Blackthorn legacy, and he made the specific sound of someone who has arrived somewhere new and has several opinions about it. 3 days after the birth, Lucien gathered the household. He did this the old way in the great hall, which had not been used for a full household assembly in years. Mrs. Caldwell organized it. The staff arrived in their proper order. Theodore stood quietly in his usual position, giving no outward sign that he had played any role in the events of the preceding weeks. Abby stood beside the other maids and spent a considerable portion of the assembly trying not to cry, which she mostly succeeded at. Seraphina entered carrying her son. Lucien walked beside her. Grace was already there, standing at the far end of the hall. Lucien spoke without preamble, as was his manner, and said what he had decided, that all household authority, effective immediately, would pass to the Duchess, that the management of Blackthorn House, its staff, its decisions, its direction belonged to Seraphina, and would be conducted as she saw fit, that this was not a reform or an adjustment, but a correction of something that should never have been otherwise. He then said something that had not been planned and that surprised everyone, including, by her expression, himself. He said, "I also want to recognize before this household A member of our staff whose courage and loyalty, when none was required of him, and some risk was attached to it, directly shaped the outcome of the past months. Theodore. He looked at the young footman directly. You wrote letters when silence would have been easier. That is the kind of character a household is built on, and I intend to honor it accordingly. Theodore's composure held for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at the floor, which is the only dignified response available to a person who is being thanked in front of an assembly and is not accustomed to it. The room received all of this with the collective quiet of people for whom several things are simultaneously being confirmed and resolved. The distribution of relief was visible. After the household was dismissed, as the hall emptied and the sounds of normal morning life began to return to the corridors, Grace remained. She stood in the gradually emptying room, and she waited. And when the last servant had gone, and only herself, Lucian, and Seraphina remained, she crossed the room. She stopped before Seraphina. She looked at her. She looked at the child in her arms. And then Grace Blackthorn, a woman who had not apologized, publicly and sincerely, for anything in the past 30 years, said, I owe you an apology I do not have adequate words for. Seraphina looked at her. She had thought about this moment, had perhaps imagined it once or twice in the quiet of difficult nights, and she had imagined feeling triumphant, or vindicated, or at minimum satisfied. She felt none of those things. What she felt, standing there with her son and her husband, and this woman, who had caused her so much pain, and was now, clearly and without performance, broken open by the weight of her own regret, was something considerably more complicated and considerably more human than triumph. Why, she asked. Not angrily. Genuinely. I would like to understand. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Because I was frightened, she said finally, and I am not proud of what I do when I am frightened. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her something. I was frightened that this family would become soft, that tradition would be lost, that everything I had spent my life maintaining would dissolve the moment someone kind enough to love, without conditions, walked through the door. A pause. And instead of examining that fear, I aimed it at you. Seraphina absorbed this. It was not a sufficient explanation. It was, however, an honest one, and honesty, she had learned, in a house that had not always been full of it, was not a small thing. She looked at her son. She thought about what she wanted his home to contain. She extended her hand. Grace took it. Her grip was firm, the grip of a woman who is accustomed to holding things tightly, and is only beginning to learn that some things need to be held differently. You have a grandson, Seraphina said. Something shifted in Grace's face. Something old and careful and long-maintained began, slowly and with considerable effort, to come undone. May I, she began. Seraphina placed her son in Grace's arms. The child looked up at his grandmother with the complete absence of prejudice available only to people under 1 week old, and apparently found her acceptable, because he settled against her with the effortless confidence of someone who has decided he is entirely comfortable and intends to stay that way. Grace's breath caught. It was not quite a sound, but it was real. Lucian, standing at the edge of the moment, said nothing. He simply watched his mother hold his son, and beside him his wife watched the same thing, and neither of them needed to comment, because what was happening was doing all its own work. Spring came to Blackthorn House with the kind of extravagance that follows a difficult winter. The grounds, which in December had been bare and gray, produced in April a riot of roses and early bloom that seemed almost to be compensating for their previous absence. The kitchen gardens are filled with green. The stone balustrades that ran along the south terrace were warmed daily by afternoon sun until they were pleasant to lean against, which Seraphina discovered and used frequently. She could be found there most mornings sitting in the sun with her son, who was by April already developing a personality that suggested he had opinions about everything and intended to express them. Lucian joined her whenever the estate's demands allowed, which was, by the clear and deliberate reprioritization of his schedule, more often than it had ever been before. Theodore was promoted. He became house steward, a position that had been held before him only by men of middle age with long institutional histories, and his elevation was noted in the county as quietly unusual and quietly correct. He accepted it with the same unhurried seriousness with which he had done everything else, including the writing of letters. Abby stayed. She asked timidly whether she might be reassigned to the nursery, and Seraphina had said yes before she finished the question. Dr. Webb began to receive invitations to dinner that were not connected to medical consultations, because Seraphina had discovered that he was an intelligent and entertaining conversationalist with a well-developed sense of the absurd, and she had decided she was collecting exactly those kinds of people. Grace changed, not all at once, and not without difficulty. There's no version of that story that is simple or immediate, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never watched a proud person do the slow, unglamorous work of becoming better. But she changed. She appeared in the nursery with increasing frequency. She began cautiously to ask Seraphina's opinion on household matters, not as a performance of deference, but as someone who had decided that the particular quality of judgment she had spent years dismissing was, in fact, worth consulting. She never again interfered with Seraphina's authority. She never again spoke of background as a deficiency. She found, over the month that followed, that there was a version of herself available when she stopped carrying the armor lighter, more tired, and considerably more honest, that she had not met before, and that it was, in certain ways, she had not expected a relief. Lucien, for his part, kept his word. Every promise he had made in the firelight of a library and on the floor of the laundry hall and on his knee in the ballroom he kept. He showed up. He paid attention. He had the courage to be wrong out loud when he was wrong, which is rarer than it sounds. He made space, consistently and with intention, for Seraphina to occupy the position that had always been hers by right and for too long been withheld. She flourished in it. Of course she did. There is a moment one afternoon in late spring, the kind of afternoon where the light has that particular quality it only achieves for a few weeks a year, golden and slightly unreal, when Seraphina is standing on the south terrace, with her son asleep in the pram beside her, and Lucien appears around the corner of the yew hedge, with his coat over one arm and his hair slightly ruffled by the wind, and he stops when he sees her and smiles in the way of a man who has not yet gotten tired of the view. "You look pleased with yourself," he says. "I am," she says. "Is that allowed?" "I believe it was always allowed," he says, walking toward her. "You simply weren't given the space for it." She considers this. And now, he stops beside her. He looks at her, at their sleeping son, at the grounds of Blackthorn House behind them, and in his expression is everything. All the distance closed, all the silences broken, all the choosing, slowly and with effort, of something better than what was inherited. "Now," he says, "the space is yours. All of it." She takes his hand. The afternoon is held around them, warm and unhurried. The baby sleeps. The roses are beginning. And in Blackthorn House, for the first time in a very long time, everything is exactly as it should be. This story carries something worth taking with you. Seraphina Blackthorn reminds us that dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you maintain for yourself while you wait for the world to catch up. She never lost it. Not on the marble floor. Not in the ballroom. Not when every societal structure around her suggested she should. That is not passive endurance. That is an active, extraordinary choice. Lucien reminds us that accountability without defensiveness is one of the rarest and most important things a person can offer someone they have failed. He did not explain. He did not justify. He asked what happened. He listened, and then he did the work. That is what repair actually looks like. Not grand gestures, but consistent, honest presence. Grace reminds us, perhaps most uncomfortably, that cruelty is almost never as simple as cruelty. It is usually fear wearing armor. The people who build the highest walls are often the most frightened people in the room, and while that does not excuse the harm they cause, understanding it is the first step to breaking the cycle. Grace's redemption was not dramatic. It was incremental, unglamorous, and real. That is how people actually change. Theodore reminds us that courage does not require a title. A footman with a pen and a conscience changed the outcome of this story. Never underestimate the moral weight of a quiet person who decides to do the right thing. And Abby, 16-year-old Abby, who tried to carry a basket and was scolded for it, reminds us that kindness, even when it is stopped, leaves a mark. The attempt matters. Try anyway. The journey of Blackthorn House was never really about title or tradition. It was about something far older and far more difficult than either of those things. It was about the courage to choose love over pride, and the willingness to do that choosing not once, in a dramatic ballroom moment, but every single ordinary day afterward. Seraphina won, not because she fought louder or harder, but because she refused to surrender the most important thing, her own sense of who she was regardless of what the room she was standing in suggested about her worth. She is the reminder that your value is not determined by the space you are given. It is demonstrated by what you do in the space you are given. If you carried anything from the story into your own life, if some part of it lit something up for you, or named something you needed named, then it was worth every word. Thank you for staying to the end. Genuinely, there are many places your time and attention could go, and you chose to spend them here, and I do not take that lightly. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. I read them, and I would love to say hello. Your support is what allows these stories to keep being told. Until next time, remember that your worth is not defined by the expectations of others. It never was. It never will be.